Okay. I think if you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. Let's go over here. So, what I want to talk about today is a little bit kind of about the research I do, which is trying to understand how materials work, why they're hard, why they're shiny, why they absorb light, how we could get electronic current out of material after shining light on it for use in solar cells, these sorts of things. And what I do is I develop computational software to help do this. But I'll put a few bits about that, but it's just a little bit more, given I've got a bit of freedom maybe today, just to talk a little bit about sort of what a model is and what it should be used for and what it shouldn't be used for. And that's it. And I've called this, I can't really remember why, murky materials modelling. I think that the idea was that there's no... The stuff I'm going to talk about, people make complicated measurements and they need help interpreting it. So that's some of the murk. But quite often we can't come up with an absolutely clear cut. What you've done is this is what you've got. What we can do is we can offer a sort of a plausible interpretation. So I'll, not exactly philosophical, but I just want to sort of get across the idea that applied mathematics is a bit different from pure mathematics. It's not something you can set up a problem and come up with a solution and demonstrate that your solution is correct. It's more a question of looking at a problem from lots of different angles and coming up with a consistent description of what's going on. And quite often that's what real applied mathematics is like. I just want to sort of mention what the limitations are of that. Okay, so sort of fundamental question: what is objective reality? I don't know. Probably it exists. I don't know what people's viewpoints are there. I'll sidestep that. I'm not a philosopher. You can talk to people doing maths and philosophy. Perhaps I'll offer a point of view. What we'll restrict ourselves to for the point of view of today is that people make a scientific measurement. So they set up some apparatus, some stuff, and at the end of the thing, the dial goes to 7, and that's the thing. And if they're doing a proper scientific experiment, they should list everything they've done to get the thing to go to 7. And if someone else goes and does the same stuff within some estimated error, they should get the same answer. If they don't get the same answer, either the description's not good enough and they've not set things up properly, or something was missing from the description, so something has changed that they weren't aware of, or the universe is non-reproducible and there's no sort of consistent underlying structure. And we tend not to like that third option. So essentially a scientific measurement is just a recipe for making a reading on something, finding out how fast something is, how high something is, whatever. And so what I'm going to discuss a little bit here is about whether or not we can actually see atoms. There's a funny hippie-ish libertarian from the 60s called Robert Anton Wilson. I think a lot of this comes about because he took too many drugs, but anyway, he made a sort of a big thing about the fact that using the word is sort of a bit of a misnomer. Almost invariably, we're using our senses as a sort of a scientific measuring thing, and all that we have is a sort of our senses giving us a measurement of what we think is out there. We don't actually have any sort of clear knowledge of what stuff is. We just have our consistent picture that allows us to go about our lives and do stuff based on what's there. And it's whether or not it's worth worrying about whether there's something fundamental underneath it or not is potentially a philosophical question. As long as there's something we can do and it allows us to live our lives as we want, then it works. So another silly little question down there: is mathematics produced by people or found, discovered? So as I say, so mathematics potentially is a little bit different from the real world because it's sort of constructed, but it's got its own fully described rules. You can set up your algebraic system, you can set it up however you like, and the rules are absolute, and if they're consistent, then you've got this complete world. Whereas the outside world, there's lots of things we could wonder about it. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we go about, or one way of trying to sort of see atoms in a material, and then I just want to emphasize that in the end we don't see atoms, we get some pictures, some signals that we can consistently interpret in terms of atoms and stuff. And eventually, that's a useful point of view, allows us to build things like the computer I'm recording this on and so on. So it's effective. Whether or not there's something deeper underneath, I don't know, but it's, that's where we're at. So this is just reiterating that. So when we're building a model, we shouldn't believe it's actually the fundamental reality. It just gives us a working model that we can work with, that we can do things, whatever. At least that's for me as a sort of science, a sort of working scientist. And a very important thing is that when we're building a model, we should only consider what the model should tell us. If we go and you can quickly Google for strange correlations or whatever, where you can correlate the number of pirates with the I don't know, the number of papers delivered on a Tuesday or something. There's many graphs. So we should have a model. We should think what it is meant to describe and only use it in that context. We should think very carefully about sort of expanding it outside. There's quite a lot of sort of moral issues at the moment with mathematical models, particularly around AI being having weirdnesses baked in and sort of reproducing biased results. So a little bit of actual sort of science, what we actually do. So as I say, I do computational modelling. So I put stuff in a computer, come up with an answer that says, I think it would be most stable if something was about this high, or whatever. I've got some clever friends who build actual stuff, and what they build in particular is what's called a microscope. As I've been hinting, the fact that it's sort of some optical device that allows you to see stuff is a misnomer. It's not. It's a more general type of scope, a more general microscope that has some signal that we can relate to whether or not there is material in a system at a given distance from the end of the microscope. So there's sort of two different types of ones that are potentially capable of seeing atoms, or at least there's more than this, but these are the ones I'm going to mention very briefly. There's something called a scanning tunneling microscope that uses some fancy quantum physics that says that an electron will only hop across a gap in space, essentially if the gap in space is very small. So you can move a tip over the surface and you'll only get a current if you get the the tip very close to the surface. By very close, I'll mention it in a minute. I'll put some length scales in a second. But it's very, very small. And another thing, which is one I've spent a lot of time working on, is a so-called atomic force microscope. And again, I'll give a bit of a better analogy for how it works. But what it works as, you've got like a clockwork element. So it is actually like quite often people use a quartz tuning fork, which you have in electronic watches. And if they're just on their own, they oscillate at a certain frequency. If you put it close to a surface that's slightly sticky, when it comes to the surface, it sticks for a little bit and comes up. So the frequency of up and down gets a little bit longer because it sticks to the surface for a little bit. So if the frequency goes down, you can infer there's something sticky near the end. And the opposite way around, if it frequency increases, there's something that pushes the thing away. So it kind of ends up doing its oscillation more quickly. And if you can position these microscope tips, if you can get a single atom or a very, very sharp tip, and then you can move it controllably on a scale of sort of picometers, which is, I'll show you in a second, like about a millionth of the width of a hair in your head, so a millionth of a micron, then you should see variations in this signal on the length scale of atoms. So what I do is I try and build a model of the surface and a model of this thing oscillating over there, and try and estimate what changes to the oscillation, to the frequency of the microscope it should get if the surface was different types of things. And then we can see if the picture that comes out of experiment looks like what we get from the simulations. So what's a surface? We start with a group of atoms, and then we can use transformations, we replicate it, and group theory, so the symmetry operations of a crystal, to reproduce it. So we take a little chunk of it and we say that it replicates in all directions, it's got some symmetry, and we can make it bigger and bigger, and our sort of mathematical model of a crystal is an infinitely repeating set of atoms. Now, if we take a sort of finite chunk of that, we stop at some point. To take a finite thing, we cut it. So we take a big sharp knife, we go chop, and we're left with that. And so this is an atomic surface. And this is, if you zoom in, if you can, on sort of, I don't know, a table in front of you or whatever, eventually you end up with something. It's made of some material, and on the top there are atoms arranged in some sort of particular arrangement, and you might get some water absorbed on the top and all sorts of complications. And so if you want to see really what's on the surface, you want to understand exactly what the surface is, you might have a gas sensor that wants to detect when things stick to it. You want to know exactly where the atoms are, and you need one of these microscope instruments. So you end up with something like that. I can build that in a computer. I can, say, replicate a bunch of atoms, get a pattern on the surface, and I can get an idea of where the atoms should be. Yeah, and surfaces change for the bulk, details. So there's been many measurements. If we look sort of on our length scale with our eyes, then we can see lots of different types of crystals. So this is a block of silicon that's, I guess, eventually cut to make CDs, for those of you that still know what CDs are. There's sugar. You can see it has this sort of hexagonal kind of pattern. It comes out in this sort of threefold axis. And then there's salt cubes. If you look really closely or get magnifying glass or something, you'll be able to see that you get these sort of cubic salt crystals. So the overall shape tells us something about how the surface is like to be. Whatever. But if we then start to zoom in, we get quite different kind of things. So there's different types of microscopes. So an optical microscope, so the one you're perhaps familiar with the lenses and whatnot, can magnify things up to about 1,000 times. And after that, you get a scanning electron microscope that can go another order of magnitude, a bit more. So I'd normally do any guesses what this is? If anyone wants to type anything exciting into chat that's not too rude, you can do, but I won't belabor the point. Essentially, the point is that things look quite different once you zoom in. And what we have here is a staple, and it's magnified by about 35 times. And you can see it's in paper, and you can see that paper is a sort of a fibrous thingy, sort of stitched together. What's the next one? So, again, getting an idea of length scales. Dandelion. So this is looking at some of the, sort of, what do you call it? Like a dandelion clock, the seeds and stuff like that. So that's about 100 times. Some pollen inside a flower, 500 times. And then this is the end of one of those microscopes I talked about, magnified by about 3,000 times. And so the end of this is really quite pointy, really quite sharp, and in an ideal world it actually ends with a single atom on the time at the end. Again, we can't really prove that in many ways, apart from the fact that what we get is consistent with that. The slides are up on the module content. You can have a look at what a snowflake looks like when you zoom right in there. So that's back to this. So this bit at the end that comes close to the surface is very, very small. This whole thing that wobbles up and down, you can see just about. It's it's the bit that oscillates around inside a wristwatch, if anyone's still got one of those. But the point at the end is really coming down to a very, 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 very sharp single object. There's quite an interesting YouTube video that some friends of mine in France made, talking about how they make surfaces and put molecules on the surface. I'm not actually going to play this because I don't want to go on too long, but if you're interested, you can go and have a look at what goes on. Let's zoom through. It just gives you an idea. There's little molecules on the surface. People can come in with these microscopes. They can sort of pick up a current or measure these finite forces on the surface. So this is obviously a sort of promo video they've made for their labs, but they can actually do this stuff. Now, how do we actually... I'll put in a couple of equations, because otherwise I'll get told off by Anita. So what we want to do is to model this oscillation frequency and understand how that changes depending on how we change the surface. So what we have is the differential equation for the oscillations of a driven oscillator. So Z is the height of the tip atom at the end, or at least some reference point on the microscope. So it's representing the bit that's going up and down. And if we were in a vacuum, we'd have nothing on the right hand side, and we would just have something that oscillated. So it would be harmonic oscillations. You'd get an oscillation. If we put it into a real system, we get some friction, we get some drag that slows it down, and we can then drive the frequency, drive the thing to compensate for the drag, so it keeps going, it doesn't just stop. But there's another term, Fz, there's a force, an interaction with the surface that depends where we are above the surface, and in fact it should depend on X and Y as well. So depending exactly where I am above the surface, I feel a different force, a different interaction with the surface, and that will change the system. So depending on where I start my thing oscillating, I will get a frequency of oscillation that depends exactly where I started and how dependent on the shape of this force. And so what we have to do to model it is to get an approximation for what this force is and then solve the differential equation to get the oscillations at different conditions. So we can drive the thing to cancel this drag force, and then actually, because in the end we want these consistent oscillations, we want it to have a periodic, so going up and down periodically for any given position, and then we move it and we get a different frequency, move it, get a different frequency, and we can plot and map these different frequencies. And because it's a periodic system, we can use a Fourier series, discrete Fourier transform essentially of the signal, which we'll be covering next week in numerical methods, to get an approximation for the frequency given where we've put the microscope. And for every different location of the microscope, we get a different frequency, and then we can map out all these different positions. We can draw sort of a colourful picture, and that gives us an image of a surface. And what you can show is that surface, that coloured picture, will have resolution. It will have features, oscillations in it that are atomic sized, which we know from other reasons. Details. Another YouTube video I won't go into. There's a guy, Phil Moriarty, Professor Moriarty. He's not particularly evil. He's based at the University of Nottingham, and he talks about similar stuff. It's about how you can get, instead of picturing it, you can actually get this frequency, you can moderate it, and actually use it to play it through a guitar amplifier to get different frequencies, so you can hear the atoms. A lot of this stuff will not really be of interest to you, but essentially, as I said, it's a cantilever, so it's like a tuning fork. You've got this sharp tip that they actually glue in, and then if you bring it close to something sticky, the tuning fork slows down. So you've just got a nice sort of physical picture of what I talked about. And you can do this in lots of conditions. What we did it was a fantastic group in Japan, and they actually did it in water. So you can have a little bubble of water on top in the tuning fork. It's not actually a tuning fork they use, but it's close enough, inside the bubble. And so you can look at what surfaces look like when they're covered in water. And again, back to the sort of overall thesis of the talk. What I did was my simulations, came up with a theory explaining what they would see and what the force would be on the end of the tip at different positions, and then we can work out the frequency response. And then in their measurements, they measured the frequency at different positions, and then they could solve the inverse problem, so they could invert that differential equation knowing the frequency shift to get the force. So that's another bit of maths called inverse problems. And then they get the force on the tip, and we could compare the two, and we could get almost quantitative agreement. And so we could say that it seems that our model on various scales is working. So they probably are seeing what they think they are in solution, and it seems that our model of what's going on sort of makes sense and works. I'm going to skip through this stuff. People can have a look. So this is what I meant about the almost quantitative comparison. Here's my calculations, and then this bit here is the measurements made by Takashi's group in Kanazawa in Japan. They're the clever people. They do these incredible measurements. Unbelievable. So in the end, what do we come up with? We think we've got a tool that will allow us to see in atomic detail what's going on in the surface in solution, and that opens the way to do lots of things to make materials that will respond to liquids or do that. We can measure the viscosity, we can measure how things stick and slip above surfaces. We could try and make things more energy efficient by creating molecular lubricants on surface, all sorts of cool stuff. But this was just coming up with a new tool and understanding this new tool to actually understand where atoms are on surfaces. And what I'm going to say is that it seems consistent. So that's all we're demonstrating. It's consistent that their measurements with an actual atomically structured surface that we're measuring in this way, and the interactions are described by our stuff. So it gives us a working model that we can use in this context to understand what surfaces are like and to try and work with them. But can we see atoms? No. What we can see is, or here, is a frequency oscillation pattern or a color-coded map of those frequency oscillations that we can then attach some sort of significance of atoms to and say that it's consistent with that. But it's not like we can actually eyeball atoms and say that that's what we're seeing on the surface. Yeah, so basically, in this case, in that particular area, it all seems to line up. But if we tried to expand our theory to something very different or went to different length scales, we tried to put colloids and bigger things in the system, we'd have to consider different effects, and it wouldn't necessarily be transferable. And there's a lot of work to get even this sort of consistent model. Yeah, so really I'm just telling a little bit of a story about how experimental theory work together, so how we build a model, how we think about what's happening in a system and how we can build a mathematical model for it, and then how we connect to experiment. And again, the difference from pure mathematics is that we can't prove in almost all cases that our model is correct. There's no such thing as correct. It just reproduces the bits of data that we wanted it to be able to do, and it can help us understand the structure of that. But you shouldn't push the model too far. You should understand its limitations. You should be careful moving the model outside of its area of applicability. And so just to prove, at least some people believe that this stuff is worth funding, that eventually being able to make controlled things on surfaces will be a very useful tool. We're able to do atomic reconstructions on surfaces and even in solution, which means not just in ultra high vacuum but in real situations. Enable new devices and stuff to be made. And the maths, there's nothing particularly flashy in the mathematics here. There's some stuff about how we calculate the forces and then how we solve the equations, but it's more about building up a model and how we apply it. So a quick thank you to all the really clever people that actually did that. And thank you for those brave souls that came along. I don't know if any of you are still awake, but thank you. I'm here if anyone's got any questions. For those that are watching later on, you can always send me an email or ping me a message on Teams, or sort of feedback any other way if you want to ask any questions about what I've presented. If anyone here, any of the brave few, will document you, wants to ask any questions, then please do so. Otherwise, that will be your lot for today, and I hope it was vaguely interesting. A little bit off topic maybe for some of you, but just a different point of view. Just showing that applied maths is very different from pure maths. Both very, very good. Both involve a lot of problem solving, but they're just very different types of problems. So I'll hang around just in case there's any questions, but I will stop recording at this point. And, yeah.